Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Welcome to Accelerated Health with Sara Banta. I'm a busy wife, a mom of 3, and an NANP certified supplement professional. But that's not all. I'm also the founder of the award-winning multi-year Accelerated Health Products, a brand offering innovative natural supplements to optimize our health. And we just launched the Accelerated Liver Care. There is no liver supplement like it. It combines traditional Chinese medicine with Ayurvedic herbs, with rainforest herbs, the cutting edge nutraceuticals, and then of course we enhance it with scalar frequencies. The results we're seeing already are just mind-blowing. So we all know our livers are under attack. Well, this podcast isn't just a source of information. It's a community. We're all here to learn and grow. And this is the springboard to learning. And the free group coaching on Telegram is where we continue learning together. You can ask your questions. I post tips and tools to deepen your health and to keep you motivated and moving forward. So here's what you can expect. New episodes every Monday and Wednesday with in-depth health discussions and expert guests. Hot topic issues that are in the news every Friday to keep things interesting. And then, of course, the Telegram health group coaching that's free, a way to continue the conversation. And all the details are on my website, sarabantahealth.com. And if you've thought about detoxing, but you're a little nervous, we'll have created over 10 unique, easy detox cleanses to help you reset your body and you feel great day one. Don't know where to start? Just take the detox quiz. The link is on the website to find out which one is right for you. Not ready for a detox, but you want to start with supplements? Well, just complete the health goals form on my website and you will get a free supplement protocol just from me. So just by taking these few steps forward, honestly, you are going to feel amazing and you will start changing your life. And today, I am going to have a guest that's going to buck a trend, and you are going to be a little taken by what we're talking about here. We've got Jay Feldman back. He's a health coach, independent health researcher, and the host of the Energy Balance podcast. I know you know Mike Fave, who's also been on, and he's his partner in crime. They use the bioenergetic approach to help men and women around the world maximize their cellular energy, optimize their health, and achieve freedom. And it is Jay and Mike that have really tweaked my teachings and put that last piece to the puzzle. Welcome, Jay. I'm so excited to be getting into this topic because as people who know me, they know that I talk about some of those healthy foods that are not so healthy for you, and I know you do as well. But this one, I think people are really going to be going, wait, what? Talking about omega-3s. And this is one of the top supplements that people take. So you're spending money proactively on it. It's not even like you're enjoying the food like you get with that processed food that tastes good, right? So let's get into it. But first, why don't you talk about where the myth comes from that these omega-3s are so good for you?
Yeah, so the omega-3s fall in the category of a certain type of fat called the polyunsaturated fats. So we generally have 3 kind of broad categories of fats. We have saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And within the polyunsaturated, we have the omega-6s and the omega-3s. And they're kind of, portrayed as opposing. The omega-6s are the bad guys that increase inflammation, and the omega-3s are the good guys and they're anti-inflammatory. And so you want to make sure you're getting a lot of those omega-3s and not a lot of the omega-6s. And that's where the concerns around seed oils come from, is because of the omega-6 content. And that omega-6 is easily damaged, causes oxidative stress, peroxidation, a lot of things that we don't want. But the omega-3s are supposed to be the good guys that we get from salmon and other fatty fish and the fish oil supplements, as you mentioned. And
right. Well, I was just going to say, just an example would be my dad, who's totally Western medicine, doesn't listen to anything I say. He takes a fish oil But he's not a supplement guy, but his doctor tells him to take a fish oil along with the statin and the other things. So go ahead.
Yeah, which is a great point, and it is one of the few things that kind of is common between a lot of the mainstream medical, practitioners and the alternative health world. So it is interesting and kind of unique in that aspect. But maybe that'll start to shift with some more time here. As I've been kind of sounding the horn about, I think that fish oil will be the new seed oil pretty soon. Um, but
So let's talk about, because seed oils, you're not a fan of those either. And those are inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids, right? And we talk about that and the linoleic acid. So the thought would be, oh, well, if you're having the omega-6s, then just have more omega-3s. It will counteract, because we hear it's all about the ratio.
mhm. And what that comes down to is a very specific effect of the omega-6s and omega-3s, which is that they get converted into downstream products, which are called eicosanoids. And this includes a number of different categories like prostaglandins and leukotrienes and a number of different compounds with long names that are not particularly interesting. But the idea is that the omega-6s convert to certain eicosanoids that increase inflammation, and the omega-3s convert to certain eicosanoids that reduce inflammation. And that there are important distinctions there, and I'm sure we'll get into those, and it's worth noting them. But that is not the only effect that these fats have. They aren't just converted to these downstream products. Instead, there's a number of other things that they do. They end up being used as fuel. They end up being incorporated into the fatty structure of all of our cells. Basically, there's what's called a phospholipid bilayer around the cells and inside different organelles. So in our mitochondria, where we're producing energy, there's a lot of these phospholipids, which are made up largely of fat, of lipids. And so whatever types of fats we're consuming are going to affect the composition of the fat in every single cell in our body and every single mitochondria in our body. And that's really important. In addition to the fats that are just kind of floating around, that are getting stored as body fat, that are being used as fuel, there's a number of interactions that are happening in all of those places as well. So we can talk a bit about the eicosanoids, but I think it's actually really a very small part of the larger picture of what happens when we consume different types of fats. And that's really important, because if we're just focused on the eicosanoids, we can kind of come away with the idea that maybe the omega-3s and omega-6s are opposing. But when we look at all those other areas, we find out that not only are they largely the same in terms of the way that they disrupt mitochondrial function and how susceptible they are to damage throughout our bodies, but we actually find that the omega-3s, because they're even less stable, because they have an extra double bond, they're actually worse in those terms. They're worse in terms of their susceptibility to damage. They're worse in terms of how inefficient they are for energy production relative to the omega-6s even. So that's kind of the lay of the land, and I guess we can dig in from there.
Well, let's dig in. And I know, we talk a lot about oxidative stress and inflammation being the cause of disease and accelerated aging and dying. We need our cells healthy. So it's the health of the cells, which is going to predict your health. And I love the fact that you talk about, it's not just about what shows up on a blood test or in that one little sliver that is being studied about omega-3 fatty acids, that there's all of these other things that are going on that no one's paying attention to. And this isn't just the one topic that this happens to. There's so many things that the blood test will tell you one thing. And we talked to Mike Fave about cholesterol and the real reasons that we want certain levels of cholesterol and versus what's on the blood test. And I've always had high cholesterol, whether it was 20 years old or 48 years old. And I see that H that's in bright red on my blood test. I think I've done something wrong, even though I know it's a good number for me. So my point in saying all of this is that it's not just one number or one faction of what something is doing. There's all of these other little things that are going on in the body that no doctor is looking at.
Yeah, and it's true. And that's a perfect example, right? Looking at cholesterol and how the omega-3s and omega-6s affect cholesterol levels. And that's one of the main reasons the omega-3s are considered to be healthy, and especially heart healthy, is that they do a good job of lowering our total cholesterol and lowering LDL. And of course, that's the scapegoat when it comes to cardiovascular disease. And the really interesting thing is when we look at how the omega-3s do that, and when we look at that, it really becomes questionable as to whether this is such a good thing. So the way that this happens is when we consume these fats, they'll make their way to all of the different organ systems in our body, and that includes the liver. And in the liver, whether they're being incorporated into the membranes or into the structure of the lipids, because the liver is where we produce fats and lipids that get sent out into, in LDL. That's where we're producing these lipoproteins and sending them out into the blood. And so when the omega-3s get incorporated in there, they're very susceptible to oxidative stress because of all these double bonds that they have. And this is, by the way, the reason why in any supplement you get with omega-3s, it should be in a dark glass bottle. You're supposed to keep it away from UV light, from sunlight. You're supposed to keep it in, in a moderate temperature. And that's because these fats are really susceptible to being damaged and going rancid. That's, basically the same thing happening, is they're either going rancid in the bottle or in your body. And we recognize how sensitive they are to this when they're on the shelf. And for some reason, we think that when they get introduced into our bodies that are over 98 degrees Fahrenheit and have all these oxidative processes going on, that they're going to be totally fine. But the reality is our bodies are a lot more dangerous for an unstable fat than sitting on the shelf. And even so, most of the ones that are sitting on the shelf in the dark bottles are already damaged, oxidized, and rancid. So coming back to the liver, we consume these fats, and let's say we somehow got ones that were not already rancid, and they pass through our digestive system again. Somehow they've gotten through, they're not damaged yet, which is rare because we know that whether we're consuming this in the form of fish oil or cod liver oil or some other form of an omega-3 supplement, they do get damaged in the gut as well. But let's say that didn't happen. They made it to the liver. They're totally intact. They're not damaged at all. And we try to incorporate them into the lipids, into the lipoproteins to get sent out. And in those oxidative processes, they often get damaged, and it creates oxidative stress in the liver. And it actually prevents the excretion of the lipoproteins, because the lipoproteins are the protein carriers that that basically carry fats and cholesterol throughout our bodies. And if they're already damaged when they're in the liver, they don't send them out, right? That acts as a signal that the liver says, this is already a damaged good. We're not going to send it out to the rest of the body to transport fats around and to transport cholesterol around. And so that happens in the liver, and that reduces the LDL export from the liver, because the LDL particles have become damaged already in the liver from having the omega-3s. And so then that lowers your LDL levels. And you take your omega-3s, you cause this oxidative stress in the liver, you lower your LDL, and your doctor says, all right, great, you're improving your heart health. Not to mention that this isn't just happening and causing damage in your liver, but also in the vasculature, and in the heart and elsewhere. So it's a perfect example of how we can look at some endpoint and be really kind of persuaded that something is going to have a beneficial outcome. But when we look at how it's happening, we see that it's potentially not as beneficial as we thought.
Well, and I love that you're talking about the liver, because I love my liver. Our livers are under attack already. So to think that you are increasing oxidative stress in the one organ that has so many jobs, and it's probably, I'm guessing, inhibiting the other jobs that it's supposed to do, correct? And this is not even, I loved also the fact that you brought up the rancid supplements, because before you even get them into your body, 90% of the fish oils out there are rancid before you even get them in your body. So taking a supplement, any kind of supplement that is rancid, probably is not a good decision and a waste of money. So those points were huge. And then when they're actually, if they get to where they're supposed to go in the right form, they're still causing oxidative stress, which is stress. And our livers, like I said, are already under massive stress with the toxins, the processed foods, the seed oils, the GMOs, glyphosate, all of this stuff. And this is just one more layer. Let's get into heart health, because that's why people like my father are taking fish oil.
Yeah. Yeah. And the biggest reason for that does come back to looking at lipids, right? So there's a lot of studies looking at fish oil and outcomes in terms of cardiovascular health. Most of them are pretty inconclusive. There's really, there's some very poorly controlled studies where they might find a benefit, but in the highest controlled studies, when we look at the meta-analyses looking at the effects of omega-3s on cardiovascular health, there's really no benefit. But the reason why they are often suggested for heart health comes back to the effect of lowering LDL, right? So we're operating on this prior assumption that lowering LDL must be good for heart health. And then we're operating on the assumption that anything that lowers LDL through whatever means must then be good for heart health. And I think those are two big leaps that we're taking there. And when we zoom in a little bit, kind of blow up that picture and see how the omega-3s are lowering LDL, it's certainly problematic. And there are other things that can lower LDL, like improving our thyroid function or increasing our metabolism, that could have beneficial outcomes and are going to help with cardiovascular health. But I would say that omega-3s are not a good solution there.
And the thyroid, I want to highlight that, because the thyroid, being the master endocrine gland, that is affecting your heart health, that is affecting your cholesterol. Cholesterol levels can indicate if your thyroid health is off. So all of these things are symptoms and signs to look for if maybe something else is going wrong, instead of taking a medication or a supplement just to lower or increase that one number, correct?
Yeah, that's the issue with having with reducing, the reductionist approach of reducing health issues to a certain marker, right? It's as simple as, if we just reduce this marker by any means, we're going to have a better outcome, and we ignore what's actually driving it, and we forget that a marker is just that. It's an indication of a state. It can tell us something about what's going on underneath, but we often, well, maybe not we, but in the especially conventional medical space, they forget to actually look at what's going on under the hood, what's causing the state, as opposed to just treating the numbers on the lab work. So I think it's really a missed opportunity there. But then when we do look at, plaque composition, right? What is making up the plaque? It's the damaged fats, the damaged polyunsaturated fats. Both the omega-3s and the omega-6s are really susceptible to oxidative stress. That's going to happen inside the vasculature, and that is, if you're going to see plaque there, that's what it's made up of, and so that's, I think, cause for concern for sure.
So we talked a little bit about the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3s. What happens if you just lower your omega-6? What happens with the omega-3s in the body?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of benefits to lowering the omega-6s, right? They are susceptible to damage. They do interfere with mitochondrial function. They do produce inflammatory eicosanoids. In general, they increase all the kind of stress hormones, and they'll amplify the effects of cortisol and things like that. So definitely something we want to do. And that alone is going to have a benefit, right? If we're reducing the omega-6s in our diet, and that's great. If we do lower the omega-6s and we look at the composition of the phospholipids, so let's say we take a mitochondria out of the liver or out of the muscle or out of the brain, and we look at the fats that are in there, that's called the fatty acid composition. We're looking at what is composing the fats there. And it's going to be some distribution of saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and then omega-6s and omega-3s. And when we reduce the omega-6s, it's typically going to leave more space for the other fats, the monounsaturated fats, saturated fats partially, and then also the omega-3s. So it's an important thing to consider that just lowering the omega-6s on its own can increase the amount of omega-3s that we're seeing in those phospholipids. And in a lot of the newer testing where they're looking at fatty acid levels in the red blood cells or in the blood, they see that high omega-3s is associated with better health outcomes. And the data there is relatively robust. But there are many confounding variables that are not considered. We're seeing this data, and normally people are saying, well, high omega-3s in the red blood cells, that must mean we should just eat more omega-3s to get those health outcomes. And the reality is, lowering the omega-6s in our diet is enough alone to increase the omega-3 composition of the phospholipids. And we see this there's research showing this by manipulating the different fatty acids. We have native populations like the Maasai, who eat very low omega-3s and relatively low omega-6s, but their omega-3 intake is far lower than, I want to say, even average in the Western populations. And yet they have high omega-3 levels in their phospholipids, relatively high at least, despite consuming very little. And that's because they consume a lot less omega-6s. And I've seen that same thing play out as well with clients who are getting these tests and they're eating basically no omega-3s at all, and yet the omega-6s in their phospholipids are a bit higher. And that kind of points to this one of the major confounding variables there, which is, as you said, if we lower our omega-6 intake, it will naturally increase the proportion of omega-3s in the phospholipids.
And it'll save you money because you're not paying money for a supplement, right?
That too.
And I'm actually doing some research on ADHD. And one of the things that they say is take your omega-3s because it helps with brain and cognition and ADHD. So can you explain where that's coming from and where they have it wrong?
Yeah, definitely. And so when it comes to brain function, there's a number of kind of different conditions that are related there: depression, dementia, ADHD. And interestingly, the omega-3s are suggested to be consumed in pretty much all of those conditions, despite the fact that when we actually look at the trials where they're increasing omega-3 intake, it doesn't actually lead to benefits there. So, and the kind of thought process with it is very similar to what we're discussing here, which is you're seeing higher levels of omega-3s in the brain. And so the assumption is, again, if there are naturally slightly higher levels there, does that inherently mean, or then we should just be consuming a lot more and that'll help the brain? But the reality, and I guess I should say the other piece there is, you can see lowered amounts of those omega-3s in the brain in disease states. And you see this throughout the whole body, right? The omega-3 level decreases in disease states. But there's another really big confounding variable here. It's not just how much omega-6 we're taking in, but it comes back to the oxidative stress. So when we have oxidative stress, it damages the most susceptible lipids that are there. And that's going to be the omega-3s. They're the most unsaturated, most susceptible to damage. And so the first fats to go to get damaged and be removed when there's oxidative stress is the omega-3s. Mm-hmm. So when we look at any sort of degenerative brain condition, anything that's going wrong there, you'll see less intact omega-3s, but you see increased lipid peroxidation products, which includes the damaged omega-3s. So you're not actually seeing a situation where the problem is just that there's less omega-3s, but rather they've been destroyed, they've been damaged by the oxidative stress and inflammation that's there due to other causes. And then we're seeing that there's less omega-3s and blaming a low omega-3 intake on that when it's really just a matter of a general inflammatory state.
Very interesting. So with omega-3 supplements, that's one thing. But what about food sources? What about eating the fatty fish, the flax seeds, the chia seeds? Okay, so Jay, I'm not going to throw money at a rancid supplement, but I'm going to get it through these healthy foods. Is that any different?
Mostly no. So when we look at the supplements, the thought process is, well, maybe this is an isolated fat and it doesn't have other protective things with it. And so that's why it's not working as well. And so you can look at studies where they use pharmaceutical grade fish oil and they add huge levels of antioxidants alongside it to try to protect it. And still, even in humans, they'll give these supplements, they'll see increased damage, increased oxidative stress, and they see that it gets amplified anytime the body's under stress. If there's fasting, there's exercise, any increase in stress hormones, all increases the damage to these fats. And so that's the supplement side. And kind of regardless of how they manipulate them, it always seems to lead to that same result. When it comes to the foods, the omega-3s themselves are no different, right? There's no difference in the omega-3 from a fish oil supplement versus the omega-3 in the fish that it came from. It's the same type of fat. And in the same way, it's going to increase the amount of omega-3s in the fatty acids and the phospholipids in our whole body, in all of our tissues, including the liver, causing the same lowering of cholesterol and oxidative stress there. And also in the mitochondria of every single cell of our body, and when they're in there, they impair how effectively we produce energy. basically because of how unstable they are, they cause leakiness in the membranes, and that reduces how effectively our mitochondria produce energy. There's kind of constantly leaking out energy um, due to the leaking of the protons. It's kind of not not that interesting biochemistry, but um, in any case, that's going to happen whether we're having these omega-3s in the best form, the worst form, whether they're coming from flax seeds or they're coming from fatty fish or they're coming from a fish oil supplement. Now, there are many other things in fish that can be beneficial, and there's a lot of nutrients in there, and you're getting selenium and iodine and maybe some calcium and obviously protein and lots of other vitamins and minerals, and that's great and important. And also, it's often better than the alternatives. So, in some of the studies looking at fish intake and seeing the effects on cardiovascular disease, what they find is that the consumption of fish is only beneficial in so much as it replaces processed foods, processed meats as the protein sources. So instead of eating, I don't know, whatever someone might get at McDonald's, like a burger, which is not even meat, it's meat mixed with soy and tons of other ingredients. They're replacing that with fish, and they're seeing benefits. But if they just have the fish and they're not actually replacing the quote processed foods, processed meats, it doesn't actually lead to any beneficial outcomes. So yeah, I think that would kind of be where I would land, is that it's really not so different whether we're consuming it in a supplement form or from a food form. However, that doesn't mean we should never eat fish or we should never eat seafood, because most fish doesn't actually have all that much omega-3s. It's really only the very fatty fish like salmon, Chilean sea bass, and then some of the small ones like sardines. Those ones are all pretty high in fat and pretty high in omega-3s, but pretty much all of the others, I mean, there's a few exceptions, but the vast majority of the other ones are very low in fat, very low in omega-3s. And that includes seafood as well, shrimp and oysters and clams and mussels. They've got a little bit of omega-3s in there, but they're very nutrient dense, a lot of great protein, tons of other benefits. So I'm definitely not saying that we should be avoiding all of those, but I would recommend that we lean toward the ones that are much lower in omega-3s.
So I love salmon, I'm not going to lie. How much is too much? Like if I'm eating it just for enjoyment, not for the omega-3s, how much is too much? Knowing that I'm on a clean diet, I don't eat processed foods, I'm doing all the other right things.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say not all salmon is equal either. You can look at the fat content of sockeye versus the coho and king and, a handful of others. I don't remember how it varies, but I know it varies considerably. Like some might have twice as much fat and omega-3s as others. And so if we really like the taste, I would go toward those leanest ones that have the lowest omega-3s. And I don't remember which variety it is right now, but you could do a search and kind of compare the amount of fat in each of them. And in that case, I think it's really not all that much. And if you're having that, once a week, I think it's totally fine. When it comes to the question of how much of that is too much for you or me or someone else, it always depends on our individual circumstances. But I would suggest, I think if a client were to say that to me, I would say, well, let's try some other fish and see if there's other ones that we really like too, halibut and mahi-mahi and tons of other options that are very low in fat. And if we really like the salmon and we're having it occasionally, I think that's not going to make or break our state of health unless we're extremely susceptible, vulnerable, and really struggling. Then maybe that's a case where you'd want to be a little stricter for a period of time. But for the vast majority of people, the issue is not that they're eating, 3 servings of salmon a week, and that's causing their health issues.
Well, as someone that has cooked all different variations of salmon, you can tell how much fat's in there because you see it in the pan. You can sop it up with a towel or try to drain some of it off if you want. And because of you, Jay, I have been exploring my mahi-mahi and my whitefish. It's not quite as good, but I have to say, I feel better. The thing that people don't understand too is, and maybe it's the omega-3s, is that when your liver's backed up, having any fat is making it work harder. And what we're seeing in the last couple of years is that because of fatty liver disease, because of all the toxins, a lot of people are having a really hard time digesting fat in general. And if you're one of those people that tried the keto bandwagon a couple of years ago and said, it's not for me, it might be that your liver is suffering, and then the omega-3 fatty acids are just making it that much worse. But the first sign for me that I need to give my liver some love is when the salmon goes, oh, I can't take another bite, right? Because you get to that point where it tastes good, and then there's just so much fat concentrated, and it just makes you feel a little nauseous. So that also, and I want to dive a little deeper into the liver health, fatty liver, its relationship to these fats, the omega-6 and omega-3s. So can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great one. And as you've been talking about, the liver is such a central organ. It has impacts on digestion, it has impacts on blood sugar regulation, on hormonal regulation, thyroid hormone conversion. There's tons of things, the detoxification. So there's tons of things that are flowing in and out, and tons of processes that are affected at the liver. And it's a really good gateway into seeing what's going on in the rest of the body. If things aren't going too well in the liver, chances are the rest of the body's not too happy either, and vice versa. So yeah, I think it's a great lens. And it's worth mentioning. So, as you said, if our liver's struggling, it can mean impaired bile flow, and that can impair our fat digestion. And that's a great point. Another thing we were kind of touching on is the oxidative stress component and how much that affects in the liver. So we were talking about in terms of just cholesterol export, and that's something worth considering, because if we've impaired our cholesterol export, that's an issue, because cholesterol is a vital nutrient. Cholesterol is a precursor to all of our steroid hormones, the female hormones, male hormones, pregnenolone on from there. Like it's a really kind of important precursor there. It's also a precursor to things like CoQ10, which are integral for energy production. And it's also used in large amounts in our brain. So cholesterol is a really vital nutrient, and the lipoproteins themselves, the transport mechanisms, are really important as well, because they're not only transporting cholesterol to those places, but they're also helping to bring back certain things that are basically irritants that we need to detoxify in the liver. And so if we're impairing that whole system with increased oxidative stress in the liver, that's going to be a major issue. And we see that happening in fatty liver. We basically have two sides of fatty liver. One is that we are having trouble exporting fat from the liver. And the other side is that we're typically producing too much fat in the liver. And that side is also heavily influenced by oxidative stress and really anything else that's going to impair our capacity for energy production. So the liver is, as we're saying, kind of one of these central highways that impacts all these other areas. And anytime we're consuming carbohydrates or fatty acids, the liver is going to pick up some amount of those, and it'll convert those into glycogen, which it can release later as basically a storage of carbohydrates. It'll use them to produce energy. It'll use them for detoxification, for bile flow, and all the other processes it needs to carry out. And when our livers are not effectively producing energy from the fuel that it's taking up, we typically see oxidative stress and basically blockage in the mitochondria and the engines, which causes that substrate to be stored as fat in the liver, whether it's fat or carbohydrates. And interestingly, most of the fat that gets produced in fatty liver is coming from fat, not coming from carbohydrates and sugar, which is typically what we're told. Watch out for the fructose; it just goes straight to your liver and becomes fat. But when we look at the sources of fat, looking at the studies where they trace where the fat is coming from, 75% of it is coming from fat, and 25% is coming from carbohydrates. Now, in both, regardless of what the fuel is, the problem is inside the engines in the liver. The problem is not the fat or the carbohydrates. Not saying that just because more of the fat comes from fat, we should avoid fat. That's, again, the kind of reductionist thinking that we want to get away from. We want to look at what's going on underneath. And a really important piece there is that of the, of all of the fat that gets used as, of the 75% of fatty acids that are being used to produce fat in the liver, 60% of that 60%. Man, that's a good way to explain this. So of the 100% of fat that's getting produced in the liver, 60% is coming from our own fat stores. 15% is coming from the fat in the diet. 25% is coming from carbohydrates. The reason why this is important when we're talking about the source of fat is that most of this is coming from our endogenous, our own fat stores, 60% there. And what that tells us is that we're under significant stress when we're in a fatty liver state, because the thing that liberates fat from our fat stores is the stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. One of their main actions is that they shift the body from oxidizing carbs, from burning carbohydrates, shifts it toward burning fats. And one of the ways it does that is by liberating fat from the fat stores by activating a process called lipolysis. And when we're in this chronic stress state and we're dealing with the systemic oxidative stress and inflammation, and the engines aren't working well, and the liver takes up these fatty acids, it's converting them right into storage and storing them as fat. And when we come back to the question of what are some of the main causes of that state, of the impaired energy production, of the oxidative stress, of the inflammation, the polyunsaturated fats, the omega-6s and 3s are right up there, I would say, tied for first place as far as the primary drivers go.
Which is so crazy, because we were all told that it's the sugars and the carbs that are causing the fatty liver disease and insulin resistance. And what's interesting is that without changing your diet, if your liver is suffering, your insulin resistance is going to increase. Your blood sugar could be increasing just because your liver is not doing its job. So whatever that means to it literally is the organ that is so important for your metabolism, your fat burning, your energy. And I love the fact that you talk about energy, because it's not just that whatever we eat is going to automatically convert into energy. There's this big chasm, and what's going on in between, and are these the chain reaction, is it happening at every step of the way so that food becomes energy. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine who has typically been on a low carb diet, and she's starting to incorporate some new foods and carbs. And she goes, Sara, I can't believe how much I'm eating, and I've lost 5 pounds. And she's a tiny girl, so 5 pounds is a lot of weight. And it's like the body says, oh, well, I trust you now. I'm not in that stressed mode, and I'm converting that food, fat, proteins, and carbs into what I need for that cellular energy.
Yeah, and that's really the central driver, whether we're talking fatty liver disease, other degenerative states, or the flip side of how well can we function, cognitively, and talking about liver functions, detoxification, all those things are energy dependent. All of those things are inhibited when there's blockages of that conversion from the food coming into energy. And I think that's really why we want to place our focus on that question. And when we improve that, when we actually improve the conversion of fuel to energy, we get a number of benefits. One is that food, instead of getting directed toward fat, we use it to produce ATP. So there's a win-win there of more energy and less body fat storage. And then there's also all of the downstream wins that come from more ATP and more energy, which allows for everything to function better.
Right. It's all about the ATP. So talking about fats, what are the fats that we should focus on? And I know we're not going to be on a high fat diet, but we do need a little fat in our diets. What are the good fats to focus on?
Yeah, of course. So we've talked about the different categories, right? We have the primarily saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats. And we really want to be minimizing the polyunsaturated fats. Normally we'll call them PUFA. And those are the omega-6s and the omega-3s. And largely, there's a number of reasons, but largely it comes down to the fact that they're really poor structural components in our mitochondria, and they lead to inefficient energy production. That leads to food getting stored as body fat and leads to low energy. On the flip side, the monounsaturated and saturated fats are hundreds of times more stable than the polyunsaturated fats. And that means that when we consume them, they're not going to be damaged, or infinitesimally smaller amounts. They're not going to be damaged relative to the polyunsaturated fats, and they're much more stable as far as building block goes to produce energy. And so we want to focus on those fat sources that are really high in the saturated and monounsaturated fats and very low in the polyunsaturated fats. So this is going to be foods like most of the fats from animal sources. So dairy is generally highly saturated. There's always some monounsaturated fats in there too. Fat from ruminant meat, beef, bison, goat, lamb, all is going to be very low in PUFA, very high in saturated and monounsaturated fats. Cocoa, like cocoa butter, chocolate, those are very low PUFA as well. Macadamia nuts, coconut, beef tallow, as I mentioned, it's a fat coming from a ruminant fat. Olive oil, those are all going to be generally very low in polyunsaturated fats. Avocado and olive oil can kind of depend on the quality, and there's
Right.
been a lot said about the fact that a lot of them are adulterated. There's canola oil added, or they're kind of cut with some of these low quality, high PUFA oils. So we want to be very careful about the sourcing there. But assuming we're getting it from a good source, avocado and olive oil are pretty decent. They only have about 10% of their fat coming from PUFA, which is higher than we'd want on the whole, but generally not too bad. So those are decent options as well.
So, Jay, we're almost out of time. And I know there's a lot of people out there, a lot of podcasters, a lot of experts that are debunking your thoughts on all of this. What would be the big takeaway for people listening as to why you are right when it comes to all of this? And is there evidence? Because it seems like there's studies on both sides, right? So it's a big question, but in summary, what would you say to all of those people?
Yeah, there's always conflicting views and studies on both sides, which makes it challenging for someone who's not, you know, deep into the research and able to parse out those differences. I think there's a couple of things I would say. One is, generally I would say I don't think anyone should just outright believe me or anybody else, and instead I think to the extent that we can, we want to try to understand the the different perspectives and understand where someone's arguments are coming from, and try if we can to understand some of the research and look through the graphics and see where some of the evidence is coming from. I think that that's a good starting place, understanding things to the extent that we can, and always trying to learn. And I think that is probably the top recommendation. Another one is, let's try things and see what your experience is. So when you have a much lower PUFA diet, how do you feel? When you're eating more or less omega-3s or omega-6s, how do you feel? And I think those can be helpful things as well. Of course, that the waters can get a little muddy there. As an example, something that I see pretty often with omega-3s is that they can have an anti-inflammatory effect. And that's true in the short term, especially. In the longer term, they tend to have some costs associated with that. They have an immunosuppressive effect, and that's really how their anti-inflammatory effect comes about. And so it can lead to some longer term issues that are sometimes harder to identify. So it's an example where short term you might find that if you have the omega-3 supplements, it might actually help with inflammation. And I've seen that in people who are dealing with joint pain and other kind of related issues. So that makes it a little trickier for just relying on our experience. But what we want to do is combine our experience and learning and knowledge as much as we can, so that we can try to put those pieces together and actually get at the source of what's causing the joint pain anyway, because it's not an omega-3 deficiency. But that's, kind of a tangent. But go ahead.
I would agree. It was about in January, and I had been exposed to the spike protein, which can definitely inhibit the liver function. And all of a sudden, every time I ate salmon, I got really nauseous. And so I stopped and I waited. I did my liver cleanse. And within a couple months, and it was interesting too, Jay, because I actually got nauseous just thinking about eating salmon. My body knew. And then after a couple months, really being on a very low fat diet for a couple months to make sure I was back into a better state of health, then I was able to eat it and feel fine. So listen to your body. Your body's your best teacher through all of this. Now, lastly, before we go, if someone's listening, they're doubling down on their omega-3 supplements, and they're like, oh no, what do I do now? Because I'm full of it. Is there a way to quickly detox from what you've been doing?
Yes and no. So the most important thing is shifting the composition of our fat intake, right? So shifting away from the polyunsaturated fats, lowering the omega-3s, and eating more saturated and monounsaturated fats. And it does take some time to shift over because we're changing the composition of all of the cells in our body. And that takes months for most areas. And for the fat tissue, that can take years. So it is a relatively slow process. One thing we can do during that process to help protect ourselves against the oxidative stress and damage and try to protect to some extent the PUFA from being damaged is using things like vitamin E, which vitamin E has a number of benefits, but one of them is that it helps to protect against lipid peroxidation. And so it's not going to fully prevent it, but it will reduce the amount of damage and peroxidation that's going on. And so that would be the main thing. There are some things that could hypothetically speed the process up if we wanted to really increase a lot of fat release from the fat stores. That might cause faster turnover there, but typically there's a cost, right? Typically that's going to require the induction of a lot of stress. So it's just something that will generally take time, shifting that fatty acid composition. But normally within a few months, most areas have really largely shifted over, but there will be continual shifts after that.
Awesome. Well, Jay, I always love being with you. Can you please tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. If people are looking for some alternative fat options, some alternative diet options, if they're trying to bring the carbs in or make some shifts in terms of the types of fats they're consuming, I'd recommend heading over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide, where they can sign up for a free energy balance food guide, where I walk through or kind of have a spectrum of all the different foods and how well they support our metabolism, and also which ones we want to be more careful with. So that's the first place I'd recommend heading over to. And if someone is really interested in the research behind the omega-3s and want to see some of the studies about how, we see increased lipid peroxidation and damage from consuming omega-3s, and when we give omega-3s in large amounts to animals, it shortens their lifespan, all those kinds of things. We did a whole series on this, a handful of episodes on the podcast called the Energy Balance Podcast. And the main series here is episodes 105 to 107. So that might be of interest to some of the listeners here.
And you're going to need to listen to them a couple times because they get into the weeds, which is great because you know your stuff and the studies are there to back you up. So I highly recommend the podcast. You are such a great teacher, Jay. So thank you for the work you do. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. Our discussion does not have to stop here. I know your mind is just blown by the fact that we're not supposed to eat these omega-3 fatty acids. So you can ask your questions and learn more in my group coaching. You can also start by getting your free supplement protocol on the website, sarabantahealth.com. Follow me on social media at Accelerated Health Products, and you can listen to this podcast, Accelerated Health with Sara Banta, on Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, and over 100 different platforms. Use coupon podcast10 to get 10% off your first order. And I'm live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So join me next time to unlock your health potential.